The horses always slowed when they passed the Thorne place. It wasn't a conscious thing the way a man might pull reins to get a better look at something remarkable. It was more involuntary than that, something in the animal sensing the rider's attention shift the almost imperceptible tightening of thighs, the weight leaning fractionally forward in the saddle. By October of 1919, every rancher on the county road between Laramie and the Colby grazing lands had developed the habit without noticing it slowing just enough to stare at what was happening between the small log cabin and the weathered barn 40 feet to its north. What they saw made no immediate sense. A woman alone working a trench that ran in a perfectly straight line from the cabin's north wall toward the barn's south-facing entrance. Not a drainage channel, the grade was wrong, the width too deliberate, the depth excessive for anything a homestead of that size would need. Not a foundation for a new structure. It was too narrow, too linear, too purposeful, in a way that resisted easy categorization. It was something else entirely, something without a name in the vocabulary of Plains construction, and that absence of a name was precisely what bothered people the most. Her name was Clara Thorne, 28 years old, a widow going on 14 months, mother of two girls who were 7 and 5 respectively, and sole occupant of a homestead that most of the valley privately considered too ambitious for a woman alone. She had arrived in the autumn of 1918 with a wagon loaded past its sensible limit, 2 daughters who watched everything with large and serious eyes, in a composure that some people mistook for shock and others for arrogance. Neither assessment was correct, but the valley had not yet accumulated enough evidence to arrive at the true one. She dug with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had calculated exactly how much work lay ahead and had made peace with the number. Her movements were economical in the way that comes not from laziness, but from genuine efficiency, each swing of the pickaxe landing where it would do the most good, each shovelful of earth deposited on the eastern side of the forming trench in a low, even row that suggested she already knew what she intended to do with it. The work was methodical. It was also, to every eye that passed on the county road, completely inexplicable. The prevailing wind in that part of Wyoming came from the north. It came from the north in August with enough force to send a man's hat 3 fields away, and it came from the north in December with enough force to kill. The high plains offered it nothing to slow against, no tree line, no ridge, no significant topographical feature between the Canadian border and this particular stretch of Laramie County, except flat grassland and the occasional homestead standing against the sky like a dare. The wind did not accept the dare graciously. Clara had spent her first Wyoming winter understanding this in terms that went beyond physical discomfort. She had understood it as a physicist understands a problem, or rather the way a woman understands something when her children's lives depend on the understanding being correct. She had watched how the snow moved, not drifting lazily the way she had seen it drift in Kansas, but driving horizontally in curtains of white, so dense they flattened the boundary between earth and sky. She had watched how it deposited thick along the east and west walls of the cabin, scoured almost entirely from the north face where the wind hit, without interruption, and stripped whatever accumulated back into the gray air before it could settle. She had pressed her palm against that north wall on a January morning and felt the cold radiating inward through the logs, with a directness that seemed almost aggressive, as though the cold were not merely a condition of the air, but a force with intention. Her husband had written about exactly this phenomenon, though he had written about it in the context of military field engineering rather than domestic survival. Edward Thorne had been a combat engineer with the United States Army, a methodical and precise man who had spent the last 2 years of his life thinking about how to keep structures functional in extreme conditions. He was killed in 1918, and Clara had received word of his death at Camp Funston in Kansas, where she had been working as a nurse in the influenza wards during the worst months of the epidemic. She had read the telegram 3 times in the supply room behind Ward C, then folded it into the breast pocket of her uniform and returned to her patients because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, and because Edward would have done the same. What he left behind beyond the 2 girls and the deed to Wyoming land he had purchased from an Army colleague who needed quick cash before deployment was a notebook. Not a personal journal, Edward had not been a man inclined toward the personal in writing, but a technical record. 140 pages of field observations, engineering principles, material notes, and structural calculations written in his compressed, left-leaning hand. He had written it partly as professional documentation, and partly Clara came to believe because he understood that knowledge only exists as long as someone carries it, and he was not certain he would be the carrier. She had read it first in grief, then in curiosity, then in something closer to conversation. In the evenings after the girls were asleep in the thin light of a single lamp, she had worked through his descriptions of trench construction and drainage design and thermal management in field fortifications with the focused attention of someone studying for an examination whose date has not been announced, but whose arrival is certain. Edward wrote the way he apparently built carefully without waste, always explaining the principle beneath the technique so that someone working from the notebook could adapt rather than merely replicate. One passage she returned to more than any other. He had written it in the context of winter fortifications, explaining why certain positions held warmth better than others, despite using identical materials and fuel sources. Moving air, he had written, is the primary mechanism of heat theft in cold environments. A wall facing still air at 0 degrees loses heat measurably. The same wall facing a 30-mile-per-hour wind at that same temperature loses heat at a rate approximately 20 times greater. This is not a marginal difference. This is the difference between a functional position and one that will fail by the third day. The solution is never to build a stronger wall. The solution is to ensure the strong wall never faces moving air directly. Put something between the wall and the wind. Anything. The air trapped behind it will do the rest. Clara had read that passage in February of 1919, sitting in a cabin where the temperature had not risen above 50 degrees in 6 weeks, where her daughters slept in their coats, where the water bucket froze solid every night, despite its proximity to the fire, where she had burned through 6 cords of wood already, and could see the remaining pile and do the arithmetic of what it meant. She had read it, and then she had looked at the north wall of the cabin, and then she had looked at the barn 40 feet beyond it, sitting square in the path of the prevailing wind, and something had assembled itself in her eye with the quiet, irresistible logic of a thing that had always been true and was only now being recognized. She did not act immediately. That was one of the things about Clara that the Valley would never quite understand, and that those who knew her best would later identify as her most significant quality. She did not act until she had thought a problem into its corners. She spent the remainder of that first winter observing and measuring and recording in a small notebook. She had purchased at the trading post daily temperature readings, wood consumption figures, observations about where the frost formed on the interior walls and in what patterns, notes on which direction the wind came from, and at what hours it intensified. She was building a case the way a careful person builds a case before making a decision they cannot afford to get wrong. By spring, she had what she needed. The data was not ambiguous. The north wall of the cabin was the failure point. The barn was 40 feet to the north. The space between them was 40 feet of open ground, across which the wind traveled unimpeded before striking the cabin with its full force. If that space were enclosed, if a structure existed to trap the air between the barn and the cabin, and hold it still, the north wall would face still air rather than driven wind, and the entire thermodynamic equation would change. She wrote the principle out in her notebook beside Edward's passage, a kind of dialogue between his theory and her specific circumstances. Then she calculated materials. Then she looked at what she had and what she could afford and how long the work would take and whether she could complete it before the following winter. Then in the early summer of 1919, she learned that Fort Russell outside Cheyenne was conducting a surplus disposal sale materials from the war effort that the Army no longer needed and was offloading at fractions of their procurement cost. She drove her wagon 60 miles each way, spent $60, and came back with enough rough-cut lumber and corrugated metal sheeting to frame a structure 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. The remaining $40 of her construction budget went to Vernon Haskell's mill at the edge of town, $30 in additional dimensional lumber, $10 in hardware roofing tar, and tin stock for fabricating the flashing she would need at the junction points. She recorded every expenditure in the notebook, dated and itemized $100 total, because precision in record keeping was a habit Edward had advocated for, and she had adopted not out of deference, but because she had discovered it was useful. She began digging on the second Monday of August. The trench needed to go down 4 feet below the frost line, which in Laramie County reached deep enough to crack foundation stones that had been laid by men who underestimated it. Edward's notebook contained a table of frost depths for various soil types across the northern states, assembled from Army Corps of Engineers data. Clara had looked up her approximate coordinates and added 6 inches of margin. Then she laid 6 inches of coarse gravel at the bottom of the trench, a detail Edward had noted specifically in his drainage sections. The gravel layer is not optional. It is the difference between a dry floor and a channel that fills with water from below and destroys everything above it. He had written this with the mild exasperation of someone who had seen the mistake made by people who thought they knew better. The stone walls she built on top of the gravel were 2 feet high, mortared with a mixture of clay and sand that she had tested in small batches before committing to the full volume. Fieldstone cleared from the property's north pasture, some of it surface rock. She had been moving off the planting ground since her arrival, finally serving a purpose beyond being an obstacle. Nora helped to carry the smaller pieces, serious and deliberate in the way of a child who has decided she is contributing to something important. Iris watched for a while each morning, then usually found something else to investigate, which was consistent with her nature. The framing went up on top of the stone foundation, rough-cut lumber notched and joined with the spare functional joinery of a structure that was meant to perform rather than impress. The roof was low-pitched, designed to shed snow rather than catch it, the corrugated metal sheeting overlapping its seams by several inches, and sealed with roofing tar applied in 2 coats. At the points where the new roof intersected the cabin's north wall and the barn's south wall, Clara spent 3 days fabricating and fitting metal flashing, cutting and bending tin stock with tools borrowed from the trading post's back room, testing each piece for fit before committing the fasteners. 2 small vented openings fitted with wooden shutters she could open or close from inside the corridor went in high on the east and west walls. Edward had noted in his field records that enclosed structures without controlled ventilation develop condensation problems that eventually compromise the structure from within. Clara translated the principle across context with the ease that had become characteristic of her relationship with the notebook. The principle was the same. The materials were different. The adjustment was not difficult. Then came the part that confused everyone who watched it. She took all the excavated earth, the full volume removed from the 40-foot trench, and began packing it against the exterior walls of the new corridor. Not shoveling it back in, not disposing of it elsewhere on the property, but deliberately, methodically building it up against the east and west faces of the new structure, tamping it down in layers, piling it until it reached the eaves. She covered the packed earth with sod cut from the north pasture. By the time she was finished, the corridor had effectively disappeared. From the county road, what had been a visible frame structure was now a low green-brown mound running between the cabin and the barn, its metal roof the only surface that caught light and announced itself as something made by human hands. The earth berming was the detail that no one in the valley had the framework to evaluate correctly. What they saw was a woman bearing her own construction, which seemed like either an admission of failure or evidence of instability. What was actually happening was the application of a principle that military engineers had understood for decades, and that civilian construction in the American plains had not yet incorporated. Soil, particularly when packed and undisturbed, maintains a temperature range far more stable than any frame wall. It does not lose heat rapidly when the air temperature drops. It does not gain heat rapidly when the sun hits it. It acts as thermal mass, damping out the extremes, holding the temperature inside within a range that requires dramatically less energy to maintain. What the corridor would do in aggregate was this: the barn to the north would serve as the primary windbreak, its mass and height disrupting the flow before the wind ever reached the corridor. The corridor itself, earth-bermed on its long sides, would absorb and hold whatever cold managed to work past the barn. The air inside the corridor would be still not warm, but still, and the cabin's north wall would face that still air rather than driven wind moving at 40 miles per hour. The heat loss through the north wall would drop from catastrophic to manageable. The fire in the cabin's hearth would be doing the work it was designed to do, rather than fighting a losing battle against convective stripping that no fireplace on Earth could compensate for indefinitely. This was the math. Clara had run it in her notebook 6 different ways during the previous spring, using Edward's formulas and her own first winter data. And every version of the calculation arrived at the same conclusion: the corridor would cut wood consumption by at least half, possibly more. The temperature differential she could expect inside the cabin would be significant enough to matter in the way that mattered most, which was the way measured in whether children slept in coats or in nightgowns. She finished the construction in late September. By then, the attention of the valley had organized itself into something with an edge to it. Vernon Haskell arrived on a Tuesday morning, dismounted without invitation, and walked a slow circuit around the completed structure. He was a man whose professional opinion carried the weight of 3 decades and approximately 60 structures in the county, and he wore that weight in the set of his jaw and the deliberate quality of his inspections. He knocked on the visible portion of the roof. He pressed his boot against the earth berm at several points. He squinted at the junction where the new roof line met the cabin's north wall, where the flashing Clara had fabricated joined the 2 structures. His conclusion delivered with the particular gentleness of a man who believes he is preventing a larger mistake. "Mrs. Thorne, I understand what you're trying to accomplish, but you've created a moisture trap at that eave junction." He pointed. "Snow is going to pack in there, melt against the wood when the temperature rises and wick into those logs. 2 winters from now, you'll have rot in that north wall that goes clear through." He turned to the earth berm. "And bearing wood in contact with soil, you're inviting moisture from below and insects from every direction. This will look different in the spring than it does now, and not in the way you're hoping." Clara had anticipated this objection specifically because Edward had addressed it specifically. The flashing at the eave junction was continuous and overlapping, sealed with 2 applications of roofing tar. The wood framing inside the berm was not in contact with soil. The stone foundation walls kept a 2-inch air gap between the framing and the packed earth on either side. She explained both points without heat, factually in the same register she might use to read a recipe aloud. Haskell listened. His expression did not change substantially. "I've seen a lot of constructions people were certain about," he said. "The drainage and the gap may help, but wood needs air movement. You've sealed this thing up in a way that traps moisture at the cellular level. I've seen it happen to structures that looked solid for 2 years before they went soft from the inside." He was not wrong about the general principle. He was wrong about whether Clara had accounted for it. The vented shutters on the east and west walls existed precisely to address moisture management during the months when the corridor was not needed as thermal buffer. She mentioned them. Haskell examined them briefly, his expression suggesting a man encountering a detail that does not entirely fit his existing conclusion. He left without changing his stated position, which was its own kind of information. By the following evening, his assessment had circulated to every regular at the trading post. The Thorne construction was a moisture trap, professionally speaking, and would show its problems by spring. The second visitor came not for professional reasons, but for personal ones, and this visit was harder to manage than the technical critique. Walt Briggs was 40 years old, broad in the way of men who had done physical work since adolescence, with a direct manner that in some contexts reads as honesty, and in others reads as an inability to soften things that should be softened. He was Edward's older brother, which made him the girl's uncle, which gave him a standing in the situation that he was willing to use. He had ridden over twice since Clara's arrival in Wyoming, dutiful visits uncomfortable on both sides in the way of relationships held together by obligation rather than genuine affinity. This third visit had a different quality from the moment he dismounted. He stood for a while looking at the completed quarter, the grass-covered mound of it, the way it had altered the appearance of the property from something conventional to something that resisted easy description. His face did the thing that faces do when they are preparing to say something the speaker has been rehearsing. He came inside, accepted coffee, sat at the table across from Clara with the cup in both hands, and looked at the middle distance for a moment before beginning. His concern, he said, was for her well-being. People were talking, and not about the construction specifically, but about the state of mind the construction seemed to suggest. A woman alone, 14 months a widow, building something that no one in the valley could categorize it, invited a kind of speculation that attached itself to a woman's reputation in ways that were difficult to dislodge once established. He framed it carefully with what appeared to be genuine solicitude, but the frame eventually gave way to what he had actually come to say. He had a buyer interested in the property, a fair price enough to allow her to return to Kansas or go to Omaha, where her sister lived, give the girls a settled life with schools and society and the ordinary structures of existence that a homestead on the Wyoming high plains could not provide. Clara set her cup down. She recognized the architecture of the conversation, the concern as opening the offer as conclusion, and she recognized also that Walt was not entirely cynical in his approach. He genuinely believed she thought that he was offering her a sensible exit from a situation he considered unsustainable. He also, she thought, genuinely believed that the property had more value in his hands than in hers, and that these two beliefs coexisted in him without any apparent awareness of the conflict between them. Her answer was patient and final. She was not selling. She was not returning to Kansas or going to Omaha. She was staying through this winter and the one after it and the ones that followed, and she intended to remain on the property that Edward had purchased and that she had been farming for over a year, with results that, while not impressive by established standards, were unambiguously functional. She thanked him for his concern. She was not, she said, as isolated as the distance from town might suggest. Walt heard this visibly recalibrated and said something that he perhaps intended as a final appeal, and that landed instead as a threat without quite being one. "You'll think differently after this winter, Clara. I hope I'm wrong." He replaced his hat. He rode back the way he had come. The conversation stayed with her longer than she would have preferred. Not the substance of it, she had no uncertainty about the answer she had given, but the subtext of it, the way it had made visible a thing that she had been aware of peripherally but had not examined directly. Her position in the valley was not simply that of an unconventional homesteader doing something the neighbors found strange. It was that of a woman doing something the neighbors found strange, without a man present to absorb the social friction that strangeness generates. Every odd choice a man makes on his own land acquires through some alchemy of gender a quality of rugged individualism that earns eventual respect even when it fails. The same choice made by a woman alone generates a different question, one that has nothing to do with the merits of the choice itself. She wrote in her notebook that evening, not data, but observation. The technical argument and the personal argument are the same argument wearing different clothes. Both are asking whether I know what I'm doing. I do. The public judgment arrived at the trading post on a Friday in early October, when the first cold snaps had begun putting a serious edge on the mornings and the social pressure of the coming winter was making itself felt in the way that community anxiety usually does by locating a target. Roy Dunbar was a large man with the unexamined confidence of someone who has never been seriously wrong about anything within his own experience, which is a narrower category than he understood it to be. He was well-liked in the valley because his confidence was usually correct about the things that immediate experience tests, weather reading, horse management, the identification of good grass, and because he was generous with his assessments, for freely sharing his certainty with anyone who would receive it. He saw Clara come through the door with the particular alertness of a man who has been waiting for a specific opportunity without quite acknowledging it to himself. The words he chose were casual in the way that rehearsed cruelty is always dressed as casualness. "Look who's here." He addressed the room as much as her. "The gopher woman herself. You finished digging your hole. Mrs. Thorne might want to stock it with acorns before the first hard freeze." Several men produced the uncomfortable laughter of people who recognize they are being invited to participate in something they are not entirely comfortable with, but lack the conviction to refuse. Clara was aware of every face in the room in the way you become aware of them when you are the subject of a public performance. She was aware of Margaret Dunbar behind the dry goods counter, Roy's wife, who was looking at Clara with an expression that Clara filed away and returned to later. It was not mockery and not sympathy and not the careful social blankness of someone avoiding involvement. It was something more specific, recognition perhaps of a kind that one woman extends to another when the subject of a public performance is the question of whether a woman is permitted to know something that the men around her have decided she doesn't. Clara placed 3 coins on the counter, salt coffee, a length of lamp wick. She picked up her purchases, turned and walked out through the door into the cold morning air, where the wind was already doing what the wind did in October in Wyoming, which was to announce the shape of what was coming. No argument, no defense, no acknowledgement that anything requiring a response had occurred. The name spread from that day forward with the momentum that small community designations acquire when they confirm something people already wanted to believe. The Gopher Woman, Thorne's Folly, the Coward's Corridor. Each version of the label encoded a specific theory about Clara's motivation: fear, eccentricity, grief-induced instability, the grandiose incompetence of a woman attempting something outside her proper domain. None of the theories engaged with the technical reality of what she had built, because the technical reality was not what the theories were about. Church socials became navigable only through a particular discipline of attention, hearing the questions about whether she found the corridor claustrophobic, whether the girls were frightened of the dark tunnel, whether she found Wyoming winters particularly hard after growing up in milder country, and translating them automatically into what they actually were, which was a collective attempt to locate and confirm a crack in her certainty. She answered each question pleasantly, and without the crack, which was itself taken as evidence of something troubling, since a woman so certain of an unconventional thing is more disturbing in some social environments than a woman visibly uncertain of a conventional one. Nora, 7 years old and possessed of an inconveniently accurate social sensor, came home from school one afternoon and said that some of the older boys had told her that her mother was crazy and they lived in a burrow like ground animals. Clara sat with her at the kitchen table and explained with the patience that the explanation deserved why people sometimes respond to something they don't understand by deciding that the person who made it must be deficient. She explained that the only reliable answer to that kind of judgment was the quality of the work, and that the work would speak in December. Nora considered this. She was 7 and December was abstract, but she recognized her mother's certainty as the thing she had always been able to use as a floor when other surfaces became unreliable. Iris 5 had not yet developed the social awareness to process the community's response as anything other than background noise, and spent most of October investigating the corridor itself with the methodical curiosity of a child who has decided something is interesting. She discovered that sound behaved differently inside than outside. She discovered that the temperature dropped when you moved away from the cabin end toward the barn end, and she reported this finding to Clara with the gravity of a scientist presenting data. Clara confirmed it was correct and explained why, simply in terms a 5-year-old could work with. Iris accepted the explanation and moved on to the next thing. The corridor was finished. The earth was packed and seeded. The flashing was set. The vented shutters were operational. The stone foundation sat below the frost line on its drainage bed. Everything that could be done had been done, and what remained was the event that would either vindicate the reasoning or expose a failure in it, and that event was coming with the mathematical certainty of the calendar. In the last days of October, with the sky turning the particular shade of hard pale blue that precedes serious weather, Clara stood outside the quarter's northern entrance and looked at what she had built. It was not beautiful. The corrugated roof caught the low autumn light with a dull metallic glint. The earth berm had settled unevenly in a few places where the tamping had been insufficient, and she made a note to address this before the heavy snows arrived. The structure looked from the outside like something a person had made in haste from whatever was available, which was precisely what it was, and the aesthetic result reflected that accurately. But from the outside was not the relevant viewpoint. The relevant viewpoint was from inside the cabin's north wall, where the thermometer would register a number in December that no one in the valley was currently positioned to predict. The relevant viewpoint was from the position of a fire that would not need to fight the wind because the wind would never reach it. She went inside. The girls were at the table. Iris was drawing something that involved a great many horses. Nora was reading. The cabin was 52 degrees, which was what October evenings produced before the serious work began, and the fire was modest burning at a rate that would have seemed insufficient to anyone who had not run the numbers and understood what the numbers meant. November arrived without ceremony and without mercy. The temperature drop was not gradual in the way that seasons are supposed to transition 1 degree at a time, giving living things the courtesy of adjustment. It fell the way a trap door opens one morning. The valley was cold in the ordinary way of late autumn frost on the water troughs, breath visible at dawn, and by the following week something categorically different had taken up residence. The sky went the color of pewter and stayed there. The wind shifted north and locked into that heading as though a mechanism had engaged, and the grassland that stretched from the county road to the distant ridgeline went from brown to a pale, battered gray under skies that promised worse. The trading post thermometer, which served as the valley's unofficial record, read 14 degrees Fahrenheit on the third morning of November. By the 10th, it had not recovered above 20 during daylight hours. People who had been discussing the Thorne construction as a topic of mild social entertainment stopped discussing it because the cold had reorganized everyone's priorities around the immediate and the practical, and the immediate and practical question was wood. Wood was the currency of survival on the Wyoming high plains in a winter that meant business. And by mid-November, it was clear that this winter meant more business than most people had budgeted for. The Colby operation, the largest and best capitalized ranch in the valley, had laid in what their foreman considered a conservative surplus 2 cords of seasoned hardwood beyond their usual winter estimate, stacked under a good roof since August. By the 15th of November, they were burning through that surplus at a rate that revised the foreman's confidence downward with each passing week. The main house, a substantial 2-story structure that Henry Colby had built with the intention of it lasting generations, was holding at 42 degrees with a fire that never went below half capacity. The foreman's children had developed the persistent barking coughs that settle into children's chests when they spend too many hours in inadequately heated rooms. And the sound of those coughs in the bunkhouse at night was a different kind of thermometer, one that measured something beyond temperature. Walt Briggs was burning close to 2 cords of mixed wood per month to hold his cabin at 48 degrees, which he reported at the trading post with the matter-of-fact delivery of a man who has accepted a cost because the alternative is unthinkable. His wife had been melting snow on the stove for drinking water since the 20th because the well pump had seized in the cold, a problem he had not anticipated and could not quickly solve. The snow melting was inefficient and time-consuming in a way that added hours of labor to days already stretched by the demands of cold weather animal management, and it introduced into the household a low-grade continuous exhaustion that wore at the edges of everything else. The families using green or unseasoned wood, and there were more of them than the valley liked to acknowledge, were discovering in real time the specific punishment that wet wood inflicts on people who need it to burn. The moisture content had to be driven out before combustion could proceed, which meant that the early phase of every fire was a smoldering, smoke-producing, heat-consuming battle that extracted warmth from the room in order to eventually produce it. Cabins filled with acrid gray haze. Children's eyes watered. Adults developed headaches that lasted from morning to evening and were attributed to the cold rather than to what was actually causing them. Two families burned through their entire cut supply and began dismantling outbuildings for material, which resolved the immediate crisis and created a structural one that would manifest in spring. The chimney fire started in the second week of December. 3 of them in 10 days each, caused by the same sequence: a family burning too hot in an attempt to compensate for inadequate insulation, creosote buildup in the flue igniting the resulting fire, either contained by luck in quick action or allowed to travel to the roof framing. The third one took half a roof before the owner and 2 neighbors got it under control, with snow thrown by the armful from the ground. The man who owned it stood afterward in the smoking wreckage of what had been the kitchen end of his home and said nothing for a long time, which was the sound of a certain kind of accounting being done. Livestock began dying. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific and demoralizing way of animals that have been inadequately sheltered, found stiff in the morning, in positions that suggested they had simply stopped the cold, having outlasted whatever physiological reserves they had been drawing on. Chickens went first frozen on their roosts and coops that had been considered adequate in normal winters. Then cattle in lean-tos and open sheds that the wind worked through without impediment, stripping heat from the animals' bodies with the same efficiency it stripped heat from inadequately protected walls. Roy Dunbar lost 8 head of cattle on the night of December 15th. The temperature had dropped to 31 below zero, and the wind was running at sustained speeds that turned the effective cold into something that the thermometer alone could not accurately represent. 8 animals that had survived previous Wyoming winters without incident went down in a lean-to that Roy had considered solid. That was solid in the conventional sense, that was simply insufficient against conditions that exceeded the conventional range. He found them in the gray half-light of the following morning, and the quality of his silence as he moved among them was the silence of a man revising something fundamental about what he thought he knew. He did not go to Clara. Whatever was happening at the Thorne place had been a fixed point in his social architecture, the thing that was wrong, the example of misguided unconventionality, the reference point that organized a certain kind of confidence about his own judgments. He was not yet ready to release it. He went instead to Vernon Haskell, who received him in the front room of his own home, and listened to the account of the cattle and offered what he could, which was sympathy, and the confirmation that the conditions were exceptional, and that exceptional conditions produced losses that no reasonable preparation could entirely prevent. Haskell believed this as he said it. He believed it a little less than he had believed it the week before. He was burning 2 cords of the best seasoned oak his mill produced, and his own home was sitting at 45 degrees, and he had been a builder of structures for 30 years, and there was a specific kind of professional discomfort in sitting at 45 degrees in the best house you know how to build. He had not ridden past the Thorne place recently. He had not wanted to. 3 days after Roy Dunbar's cattle died, on an evening when the temperature outside was 35 below, and the wind was doing what it had been doing for 2 weeks, which was everything in its power, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. Nora and Iris were in the loft asleep. Their breathing was the slow, uncomplicated breathing of children whose bodies were not working to stay warm, whose muscles had not contracted into the defensive postures that cold imposes on sleepers in inadequate rooms. Neither had worn anything to bed beyond their usual cotton nightgowns in the single wool blanket that was their standard covering, because the single wool blanket was sufficient and they had stopped thinking about it. The notebook was opened on the table in front of Clara. The lamp cast a circle of yellow light that reached the edges of the page and not much further. Outside, the wind made the sound it made when it was working at full capacity. Not a howl exactly, more of a continuous low-frequency pressure, the sound of something vast and indifferent pressing against every surface it could reach. Inside, the fire in the hearth was burning at what would have appeared to any outside observer as an almost irresponsible modesty. A small, steady fire. not the desperate roaring combustion that was consuming other people's wood supplies at rates that would not survive the winter. A fire doing exactly the work required of it because the work required of it was not extraordinary. The entry for December 20th read, outside temperature estimated minus 35. Inside temperature 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumed since morning approximately zero point 0.4 cubic feet. Corridor wind reading by candle test negligible movement. North wall interior surface cool dry. No condensation. No frost formation at base. Haskell's predicted moisture damage not observed at any point of contact between framing and berm. Below the data she had written in a slightly different hand, slightly slower, the letters more deliberate. The arithmetic of this is very simple. The principle is very old. Edward understood it in the context of something that was trying to kill men quickly. I'm applying it to something that was trying to kill my daughter slowly. The only question was whether I had understood his notebook correctly. The notebook was correct. She closed it, sat for a while in the warmth and the quiet. The only sound inside was the fire's small and steady voice. A footstep on the loft ladder, careful, deliberate, the step of a child trying not to wake a sibling. Iris appeared at the bottom in her nightgown, hair loose, eyes at the three-quarter setting between sleep and waking. She crossed the floor in bare feet without hurrying, poured herself water from the pitcher on the counter, drank it, set the cup down with the careful placement of the not quite awake. Then she looked at her mother with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to wrap observations in social context. "Mama, why is our house warm?" Clara held out her arm. Iris came into it warm and loose-limbed and leaned against her mother's side with the total confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt the surface she is leaning on. Clara kept her arm around her daughter and looked at the fire for a moment before answering. "Because your father knew something important, and he wrote it down, and I read it." Iris considered this with the gravity she applied to information she was deciding whether to store. Then she went back to the ladder and up to her blanket, and the cabin was quiet again. Clara did not sleep for another hour. She sat with the fire and the data and the silence, and the wind pressing against the exterior of the corridor 40 feet to the north, spending its force against earth and trapped air, and the plain physics of a problem that had been correctly solved. It was in the third week of December that the difference became impossible for the valley to ignore. The smoke from the Thorne chimney was visible from the road, and it told its own story. Every other chimney in the valley was producing the thick, dark, urgent output of fires burning at maximum capacity, the visual signature of structures hemorrhaging heat and demanding constant replacement. The smoke from Clara's chimney was thin and pale and unhurried, rising in a straight line, before the wind caught it, the kind of smoke that a fire produces when it is doing precisely what it is supposed to do. A neighbor named Patterson, riding toward town on December 22nd, with his collar up and his head down against the wind, happened to look toward the Thorne property at the precise moment that Clara walked from the barn entrance to the cabin door. He reined in his horse without deciding, to the animal responding to the same involuntary tension that had been slowing riders past this property since August. She was not wearing a coat. Patterson stayed motionless on his horse in 30 below zero wind for a full 10 seconds, watching a woman he knew to be a widow living alone with 2 small children cross 40 feet of open ground in a wool blouse and a canvas apron, moving at a deliberate but unhurried pace, carrying a pail and disappearing through the cabin door. He sat there for another moment after she had gone inside the wind, doing to him what wind at that temperature does, which was to make the concept of standing outside in shirt sleeves seem like something occurring in a different physical universe than the one he currently occupied. He told the story at the trading post that afternoon, and it landed differently than stories about the Thorne construction had been landing since August. The social mechanism that had been organizing those stories, the frame that processed them as evidence of eccentricity or instability, encountered something in Patterson's account that it could not straightforwardly accommodate. A woman walking in shirt sleeves in conditions that had killed 8 of Roy Dunbar's cattle and were driving healthy adults to the edge of manageable suffering was not a detail that fit the existing interpretation without considerable strain. Some people offered competing interpretations. She had only been outside for a moment. She had been warmer than she knew. Roy Dunbar, who was present, said nothing. He had been quiet in public since the morning he found his cattle, and the quality of his silence had changed in ways that people who knew him noticed without quite being able to characterize. Vernon Haskell heard Patterson's account and felt something shift in the architecture of his professional certainty. He had been right about structures for 30 years, right in the specific testable way that a craftsman is, right. His roofs did not leak. His foundations did not heave. His joints did not separate. He was right in this particular verifiable sense often enough that it had become difficult to distinguish between that kind of rightness and a broader rightness that the profession of building did not actually confer. He thought about what 45 degrees in his best house felt like. He thought about a woman in shirt sleeves. He made a decision on the morning of December 23rd. The decision involved loading a quarter quart of his best seasoned oak onto a supply sleigh, the kind of high-quality material he set aside for clients who had paid for the best and would notice the difference. He told his assistant, a young man named Curtis, who had worked at the mill for 3 years and had developed an accurate sense of when his employer's decisions were worth questioning and when they were not, that they were making a delivery to the Thorne place. Curtis asked no questions and loaded the wood. Haskell told himself during the 20-minute drive that the gesture was charitable, a professional courtesy to a family. He had concerns about extended without conditions, the kind of thing a community did for its members in exceptional circumstances. He told himself this with enough internal commitment to believe it for most of the drive. In the last half mile as the Thorne property came into view, and he could see the thin, pale line of smoke rising from the chimney against the gray sky, the charitable interpretation began to require more maintenance than he was willing to give it. He was going because he needed to know. He was going because Patterson's account had lodged in him like a splinter, and the only way to address it was to put himself in the room and look at whatever there was to look at. The wind at 35 below hit him when he climbed down from the sleigh with a focused malice that reminded him, as it always did in conditions like this, that the Wyoming high plains had not been designed with human comfort as a priority. His hands were functionally numb before he reached the door. He raised his fist to knock, and the impact he felt was approximate the sensation of contact with a surface reaching him at a slight remove from the actual event. The door opened. Not Clara, a child in a cotton dress the color of a summer skate, dark hair, in 2 braids, looking up at him with the calm of a person who has not spent the last 3 weeks in a state of thermal emergency. He recognized Nora Thorne, 7 years old, whom he had seen at church before the winter set in, and who at that time had been bundled in wool in the way of all children in Wyoming autumn. She was not bundled now. She was wearing a dress appropriate for a mild September afternoon. Haskell stood in the doorway for a moment that was longer than it should have been. The air that came out of the open door was not the heated blast of a room with a fire burning at capacity, that particular kind of aggressive warmth that announces itself immediately and usually carries a smell of scorched wood and desperate combustion. It was something different, even, dry. The temperature differential between inside and outside reached him as a physical fact rather than a dramatic event, the way a steady thing differs from an emergency. Inside, Iris sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and several lengths of colored thread she was arranging into some design that was clear to her, if not immediately to observers. She looked up, assessed Haskell with the frank curiosity of a 5-year-old, apparently found him unalarming, and returned to her thread. Clara came through the interior door from the quarter side, a pail of fresh milk in her right hand, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, an apron over her clothes. She looked at him with the expression of someone who was not entirely surprised to find him there. "Mr. Haskell, come in out of the wind." He stepped inside. Nora closed the door behind him with the proprietary competence of a child who has been assigned this responsibility and takes it seriously. Haskell stood in the middle of the room and felt the warmth settle around him from all sides. Not the aggressive, slightly desperate warmth of a well-stoked emergency fire, but the ambient, settled warmth of a room that had been the temperature it was for a sustained period of time without drama. His eyes went to the thermometer on the wall beside the north window. He had installed it himself 18 months earlier as part of the construction work he had done on the cabin before Clara arrived. He knew it was accurate because he had calibrated it against the mill thermometer before mounting it. He walked to it. The mercury stood at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He looked at it, looked away, looked at it again with the specific attention of a man making absolutely certain he is reading a scale correctly and not introducing error through wishful thinking or its opposite. The mercury had not moved. 68 degrees. Outside the window beyond it, the air temperature was 35 below zero. The arithmetic of the difference assembled itself in his mind without being invited. 103 degrees between inside and outside, maintained on a fire he could see. From where he was standing, a fire of a size and character that no one in the valley was currently using, because no one in the valley had believed that a fire of that size could hold a room above 50 in conditions like these. He put his hand on the north wall. The wall he had told Clara would be rotted by spring moisture, saturated, structurally compromised. The wall was cool to the touch, not the shocking cold that a conventional north wall produced in December, the cold that radiated inward and had to be compensated for constantly. It was the cool of a surface that was losing heat at a rate that the room's modest fire could address without difficulty. And it was completely entirely dry. No frost at the base, no moisture at the log joints. No evidence that anything Haskell had predicted was in the process of occurring or had been at any point. He stood with his hand on the wall for a moment that extended past what was socially conventional for standing with one's hand on a wall. Then he found the nearest chair and sat down in it without being invited, and set his hat on his knee and looked at Clara Thorne with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place that his map did not indicate existed. Mrs. Thorne. He heard his own voice come out flat and stripped of its usual professional timbre. I brought wood. I came because I thought you were in trouble. He looked at the girls at Iris arranging thread with focused unconcern at Nora, who had resumed the book she had apparently set down to answer the door. What are you burning? Pine and cottonwood. Clara poured coffee from the pot on the stove. Whatever the property produces. We're going through about 3/4 of a cord every 2 weeks. The number went into him like something sharp. He had delivered wood that morning to the Carver family, who were burning nearly half a cord a week and had held their main room at 40 degrees. He was burning 2 cords a month himself and sitting at 45. 3/4 of a cord every 2 weeks was not a different quantity. It was a different system operating by different rules, and the rules he had been applying for 30 years had not produced anything resembling 68 degrees. He was quiet long enough for Clara to pour a second cup and set it in front of him on the table. He drank from it, then he looked at her directly. I want to see the corridor. She led him through the interior door. The corridor air was cold in the way of an unheated space, perhaps 20 degrees, perhaps a little less. But it was absolutely still. The contrast with the outside was not primarily thermal, it was atmospheric. The wind that had been working on Haskell's face and hands and the back of his neck for the 20 minutes he had spent outdoors was entirely absent. He could hear it on the other side of the earth-bermed walls, a low, continuous pressure sound, the voice of something large pushing against something that declined to move. Inside the candle Clara held produced a flame that stood straight and did not flicker. He walked the length of it, 40 feet stone floor, low roof, the earth-bermed walls on either side radiating the stable coolness of deep soil rather than the penetrating cold of surfaces exposed to moving air. At the barn end, he could hear the animals in the corridor carried the faint warmth of their bodies as a detectable presence in the air, not heat exactly, but the absence of the last degree of cold. He stood at the midpoint and looked back at the cabin door, then forward at the barn entrance, and understood in a structural sense what he had failed to understand from the outside. This was not a covered walkway. This was an airlock. A 40-foot offer of still-contained air interposed between the prevailing wind and the cabin's most vulnerable surface, shielded on its long flanks by the thermal mass of packed earth that did not shed temperature the way framed walls shed it. The barn to the north was absorbing the wind's first assault. The earth was absorbing the cold's patient work. The cabin's north wall was facing the result of both those absorptions, which was close to nothing. The wind never touches the house. Clara's voice in the enclosed space was very clear. That is the complete explanation. We aren't fighting the cold. We moved out of its way. He stood there with the wind audible on the other side of the wall and nothing moving in the still air around him, and 30 years of professional practice reorganized itself in his mind with the quiet, unavoidable thoroughness of a reckoning that has been postponed as long as it can be. When he spoke, it came out as the thing. It was not a professional assessment, not a qualified acknowledgement of a specific technical point, but the statement of a man confronting the distance between what he had known and what was true. We've been building wrong for 70 years. Clara did not respond to this. She had not required his acknowledgement, and receiving it did not change the content of what she had built or the validity of the reasoning behind it. She let the statement exist in the still air of the corridor without addition. Back inside, Haskell sat for another quarter hour with his coffee. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and produced the comparison he could not stop making. His voice had the flatness of someone reporting a fact they would have preferred not to report. My house is 45 degrees. I'm burning 2 cords of seasoned oak a month. He paused. I built it myself. The data laid against the data from other households in the valley was not a matter of degree. The Colby Ranch at 42 on 2 Amazon, Walt Briggs at 48 on nearly 2 cords of mixed, Haskell at 45 on 2 cords of the finest oak in the county, Clara Thorne at 68 on 3/4 of a cord of pine and cottonwood that she cut from her own property. The gap between the last number and the others was not the gap between good engineering and better engineering. It was the gap between a solved problem and an unsolved one. Haskell rode back toward town with his quarter cord of oak still in the sleigh, because Clara had declined to take it and had done so without any emphasis that might have constituted a point being made. What he was being quiet about for the rest of that day and into the evening was the specific experience of discovering that the most important thing you know how to do contains a fundamental error, and that someone with less experience and fewer credentials and a dead husband's notebook had found and corrected it while you were telling her she was wrong. Roy Dunbar heard about the visit from Curtis, who had waited on the sleigh and had his own account of what he had observed through the cabin window before Haskell emerged. Roy processed this information in the continued public silence he had maintained since his cattle died. That evening, he rode past the Thorne property on his way home from the Colby place, and he slowed his horse at the point on the road where the corridor was most visible, and he looked at the grass-covered mound with the low metallic roof and the thin pale chimney smoke and the lit window of the cabin behind it, and he sat there in the dark and the cold for a long moment before riding on. He did not stop. He was not ready to stop, but the social certainty that had organized his public position on the subject was no longer functioning as it had been, and the space it had occupied was now filled with a question that the data had been asking since November, and that the number 68 had made at last impossible to defer. The freeze broke on the 14th of January, not with warmth but with a slight, almost reluctant moderation, the temperature climbing from 30 below to 12 below, as though the cold were not retreating but simply pausing to reconsider. People came out of their cabins the way animals emerge after a long underground interval, carefully testing the surface, not yet certain the threat had passed. What they found was a valley that had been rearranged by the winter in ways that went beyond the physical. Wood piles that had seemed adequate in October were gone or nearly gone. Livestock counts were down across every operation of any size. 2 families had abandoned their homesteads entirely during the worst weeks, loading what they could carry, and going to relations in Cheyenne, leaving behind structures that would stand empty until spring determined whether they were coming back. The community had the specific quality of people who have been through something together but have not yet found the language to discuss it accurately, which meant they were discussing it in the only language currently available, which was the language of exceptional circumstances and bad luck in the kind of winter that comes once in a generation and cannot be predicted or prepared for. This language was not adequate to what had actually happened, and most people in the valley knew it was not adequate, and the inadequacy sat in conversations as a slight, persistent discomfort that sharpened whenever anyone mentioned the Thorne place. The Thorne place had not been rearranged by the winter. The firewood pile behind the cabin had diminished at the rate Clara's calculations had predicted. Vernon Haskell had told 3 people about the thermometer reading before he stopped telling people, not because he doubted what he had seen, but because the telling produced a response he was not equipped to manage, a kind of aggressive skepticism that had nothing to do with the data and everything to do with the implications of the data being correct. When a fact is inconvenient enough, the people who resist it are not actually arguing about the fact. They are arguing about what accepting the fact would require them to change, and that is a different argument with a different emotional temperature. Some people said the cabin was small. This was true but incomplete. Some people said she had good wood. This was not true. She had cut pine and cottonwood from her own property, the least prestigious fuel in the valley, the wood that people burned when they had nothing better. Some people said the cold had not been as severe on her particular property, which was geographically untenable given the distances involved, but which had the advantage of being difficult to disprove without going to the trouble of actually disproving it. Clara heard these explanations secondhand through the daughter's reports from school and through the occasional conversation at the trading post that she was not quite meant to overhear. She wrote none of them in her notebook. The notebook was for data, and competing theories about the data were not data. She continued recording temperatures and wood consumption and corridor wind readings every morning because the winter was not over, and the record had value regardless of what anyone chose to believe about it. Harold Fitch arrived on the 22nd of January. He was the Wyoming Agricultural Extension Service's regional agent for the Southeastern District, a deliberate and careful man in his early 50s who had spent 20 years developing the professional habit of treating every reported agricultural innovation with the same initial skepticism and the same commitment to letting the measurement decide. He had received a letter from Haskell, formal specific requesting an official evaluation of what Haskell described, with uncharacteristic understatement, as a potentially significant development in Plains Homestead construction. Fitch had read the letter twice and packed his equipment the following morning. He arrived with a leather case that contained 2 calibrated thermometers, an anemometer for measuring wind velocity, and the government-issue notebook in which he recorded his findings in a hand that a court of law could read without assistance. Clara received him with the same straightforward practicality she brought to every visitor: coffee on the table, the data available, no performance in either direction. Fitch was methodical. He placed his first thermometer inside the cabin, his second outside the north entrance of the corridor, and waited the prescribed interval for both to stabilize before recording. Inside 67 degrees Fahrenheit, outside 22 below zero. He wrote both numbers in his notebook, drew a line between them, and sat for a moment looking at the line. The differential was 89 degrees. He had evaluated dozens of homesteads over his career and assessed numerous construction innovations. He had never written a line in his notebook that looked like this one. The anemometer reading restructured his expectations a second time. In the open, the instrument recorded gusts to 40 miles per hour. He then moved to the interior of the corridor, positioning the instrument at the point closest to the cabin's north wall. The cups turned at a rate that produced a reading of 3 miles per hour. He checked the instrument, checked it again. 3 miles per hour with occasional drops to 2. Against 40 miles per hour outside the corridor was producing a 92% reduction in wind velocity at the surface that mattered most. He examined the north wall's interior surface for the moisture damage that Haskell's letter had described as the central technical dispute. No frost formation, no moisture at the log joints, no soft spots in the lower courses. He pressed on the wood at the base of the wall in several places. Solid. He examined the flashing junction. Set correctly, sealed properly, no evidence of water infiltration. He asked to see the notebook. Clara brought it to the table without comment. Fitch opened it to the first entry from the previous November and began reading forward. He did not read quickly. He turned pages at the pace of someone processing content rather than surveying it, occasionally going back to recheck an earlier entry against a later one. He read for nearly an hour. When he closed it, he looked at Clara with an expression that had moved past the professional neutrality he had maintained since his arrival. "You've been keeping this record since the first winter." It was not quite a question. "Since December of 1918, Clara confirmed. "The first winter was the baseline. This winter is the comparison." Fitch then asked her to walk him through the construction sequence from foundation to berm, which she did standing in the corridor with the wind audible on the other side of the earth walls, describing each decision and its basis in the specific, non-defensive way of someone who built from principles rather than intuition and can account for every choice because every choice was accounted for before it was made. He asked about the source of the principles. Clara described Edward's notebook without elaboration, a field engineer's technical record applied to a domestic context, adapted where adaptation was required. Fitch asked whether he could examine it. He handled it with the care a document deserves when it has become evidence of something larger than the circumstances of its creation. When Fitch left, he carried his measurements and his notes and a commitment to return with his formal assessment. He also carried a revised understanding of what was possible in plains construction and what had been unnecessarily surrendered to the assumption that the cold was a force to be fought rather than redirected. Walt Briggs arrived without warning on a Thursday morning the last week of January. He tied his horse at the post outside and came to the door with his hat in his hands, in the specific posture of a man who has made a decision that required him to absorb something before he could act on it, and who has now absorbed it. "I'd like you to show me how it works." No preamble, no reference to the conversation in September, to the offer to buy the property, to the prediction that the winter would revise her thinking. Just the request stripped of everything that a man with less self-knowledge might have wrapped it in. Clara let him in. She poured coffee. She began explaining. She was 40 minutes into the explanation, having covered the drainage foundation, the stone coursing the framing dimensions, the earth berming sequence when she went to retrieve the construction notebook from the shelf beside the north window. Moving past the coat rack near the door, she noticed that Walt's jacket had shifted from where he had hung it, and that from the breast pocket, a folded piece of paper protruded at the angle of something that has been folded and unfolded enough times to hold its shape independently. She could see from where she was standing a corner of what was clearly a sketch. Pencil lines in the proportions of a structural drawing, a low roof line, the distinctive rectangular footprint of a corridor connecting two existing buildings. She took the notebook from the shelf. She returned to the table. She continued the explanation, covering the vented shutter placement and the critical point about maintaining the air gap between the framing and the packed earth, the point at which well-intentioned variations most commonly failed. She explained it with the same completeness she would have given to anyone asking in good faith. At the end, when Walt was gathering himself to stand, Clara placed the construction notebook on the table, and then beside it set the folded piece of paper she had removed from his jacket pocket while he was examining the corridor entrance. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not say anything. "You can build it," Clara said. Her voice carried no heat, no performance of injury. "You can call it whatever you want to call it, but the drainage layer is not optional, and if you omit it because you want to move faster, you'll have moisture in the framing by the second spring, and your family will know, and you will know who told you not to skip it." Walt picked up the paper. He folded it and put it back in his pocket, stood, thanked her for the coffee, and left. He built the corridor that spring. Every element she had described was present in the construction. The drainage layer was there. The earth berm was correctly packed and properly proportioned. The flashing at the junction points was cut and fitted with a patience that his neighbors remarked on because Walt Briggs was not a patient carpenter under normal circumstances. He did not put his name on the design. He did not put Clara's name on it either. When people asked where he had gotten the idea, he said he had made some modifications to his north exposure, and they had worked out well and redirected the conversation towards something else. Clara did not pursue the matter. The quarter he built would keep his family warm, and his family's warmth was the point of the knowledge, not the attribution of it. Fitch returned in the first week of February with a draft of his formal report. He sat at Clara's table with the draft between them and went through it section by section, explaining his methodology and his findings and the language he had chosen to describe the construction principles in terms that would be comprehensible to other agricultural agents and to the farmers who would eventually receive the bulletin he intended to publish. The document was precise and clearly written and contained on its title page. The attribution line, the Thorne method, attributed to E. Thorne, Homestead, Engineer, Wyoming, 1919, Edward Thorne. Clara read the attribution twice, not with surprise, but with the particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they had expected and had therefore already begun thinking about how to address. Fitch had written the attribution in good faith, which was also in incomplete faith. The assumption embedded in it was so ordinary in 1920 that he had not recognized it as an assumption. A homestead that had produced a significant engineering innovation, a technical notebook that had provided the foundational principles, the name Thorne connecting both. The conclusion was not unreasonable from where he was standing, it was simply wrong. Clara set the draft on the table. She thought about what was true. Edward had understood the principles. He had written them with precision and care, and with what she had come to believe was at least a partial intention that they should survive him in a usable form. His contribution was real and foundational. She had arrived at Wyoming with his notebook and his principles and his way of thinking about how forces work on structures, and she had applied all of those things to a specific problem in a specific place. And the application had required its own judgment and calculation and adaptation and physical labor. And it had worked. Both things were true. The attribution in front of her honored one of them. She picked up the pen Fitch had left on the table beside the draft. At the bottom of the attribution line, she wrote, "Applied and constructed by Clara Thorne, 1919. She slid the draft back to Fitch. He read what she had added. He looked up at her. "I assumed incorrectly," he said. The directness of it was the right response, and he delivered it without embellishment, the way a man admits an error when he is secure enough in his position to do so without defensive architecture. "You assumed what most people would have assumed." Clara refilled his coffee. "The correction is all I'm asking for, not anything more." Fitch incorporated the correction into the final draft that afternoon before he left. The attribution on the published bulletin would read, "Principles documented by Edward Thorne, Field Engineer. Application and construction by Clara Thorne, 1919. It was accurate. It was enough." The bulletin came out in the autumn of 1920 under the Agricultural Extension Service, heading 17 pages technical in register, but written with the lucidity that Fitch brought to documents he intended to be used rather than filed. It circulated to every extension agent in Wyoming and through the network of interagency correspondence that the federal agricultural system maintained to counterpart offices in Montana and the Dakotas. It arrived on desks and in filing cabinets where it would be consulted by builders and agents who had no connection to Laramie County and no knowledge of the social history that had preceded its publication, and who encountered the Thorne method as simply a better way of thinking about the problem of convective heat loss in cold climate construction. Within the valley, the changes were uneven in the way that real change is always uneven. 7 families began building windbreaks in the spring of 1920 before the ground fully thawed. Two of them omitted the drainage foundation because they were in a hurry and had decided that step was probably overcautious. By the following spring, both constructions showed the beginning of moisture infiltration in the lower framing, exactly as Clara's notebook indicated would happen in the absence of the drainage layer. She rebuilt both structures with the owners working through the correction systematically and without the comment that the situation might have suggested she was entitled to. The other 5 constructions worked. By the following winter, 19 cabins in the valley had some version of a northern windbreak, ranging from Clara's fully integrated earth-bermed corridor to simpler wind walls that applied the dead air principle in a less complete form. The valley's aggregate wood consumption that winter was lower than it had been in any recorded year. Roy Dunbar built one. He built it larger than his property required, the wall taller than necessary, the air gap wider than the minimum effective dimension, as though excess were a hedge against the embarrassment of having been the loudest opponent of the principle the wall embodied. He built it without asking anyone for guidance, which meant he made several suboptimal choices in materials and siting. The construction worked anyway because the core principle was sound enough to tolerate imprecision in its execution. He did not mention Clara's name in connection with it. If asked, he said he had been thinking about north exposure for a while and had decided to do something about it. Vernon Haskell changed more than he changed publicly. Every structure he built or advised on from the spring of 1920 forward included a recommendation about north side wind exposure, and several included constructed windbreaks incorporated into the plans from the design stage. He developed a set of specifications for the foundation drainage that he distributed to the mill's major customers as a handout. When his assistant Curtis asked whether the Thorne corridor design was something the mill should start offering as an add-on service for new construction, Haskell considered the question for a moment and said yes, they should, and to call it the windbreak edition in the catalog and to price it fairly. Nora and Iris grew. The garden expanded. The property became, over time, the kind of place that a widow with 2 daughters and $100 in a dead husband's notebook can build when she is both correct about the important things and willing to do the work that being correct requires. The corridor never failed. The north wall never rotted. The drainage layer that everyone had thought was overcautious drained correctly every spring. The vented shutters controlled the summer moisture as designed. Every element held to the specification it had been built to year after year in the reliable way of things that were correctly conceived before they were built. The reporter from the Cheyenne paper came in the summer of 1922. He was young and had read Fitch's bulletin and had come to write what he described as a human interest story about an overlooked innovation. He asked whether she was proud of what she had accomplished, whether the recognition had been adequate, whether the valley had treated her fairly given how events had resolved. Clara looked out the window. The corridor was visible from where she sat, the grassed-over mound of it unchanged in its essentials from the autumn she had built it, the corrugated roof catching the summer afternoon light. The earth around it had settled and consolidated and grown over in a way that made it look as though it had always been there. I wasn't trying to be recognized, she said. I was trying not to put my daughters to bed in their coats. She looked at him steadily. I succeeded at the thing I was trying to do. Everything else is secondary. He asked whether she missed Edward. She answered simply, she missed him every day, and the notebook he had left was the form his thinking took in her life now, and the corridor was the form his thinking took in the world, and that was a kind of continuity she found meaningful. The corridor still stands. It has outlasted newer structures built with better materials and larger budgets, and the involvement of professional builders who knew by the time they built them exactly what a windbreak was and why it mattered. The earth berms have settled into the land so thoroughly that from the road it is difficult to distinguish the construction from the natural topography. Perhaps the highest form of compliment available to a piece of engineering to become indistinguishable from the landscape it was designed to work with rather than against. The name Clara Thorne appears in Harold Fitch's bulletin in the attribution line, in the carbon copy of a construction permit filed with the Laramie County Recorder in the autumn of 1919, and in the Cheyenne newspaper article from the summer of 1922. It does not appear on a building, a street, a school, or any of the structures that the principles she applied helped to make warmer and more survivable. Most knowledge travels without its carrier's name attached, moving through the hands of people who received it from other hands that received it from others still, until the original point of application is too far back in the chain to be visible from the present. What is visible is the thing itself, the corridor, the earth berm, the still air against the cabin wall, and the two girls who slept through the worst winter in a generation in cotton nightgowns, warm, undisturbed, while the wind spent itself against 40 feet of packed earth and solved physics, in a mother who had read a dead man's notebook until she understood it well enough to build what it described. Some things do not fit the available categories. That is the beginning of the process by which they become new ones.